that is only painful or not fun for someone else, if they do, that's not kink, that's not fun, run away. What is the thing that I say?
Okay, hi everybody.
Don't tell me what to say. Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for coming back if you've been here before, or hi, welcome if you're new. My name is Mickey, I'm a therapist, and we talk about therapist-y things on this channel. Today, we're talking about 50 Shades of Grey because I think it's a useful way for us to jump into talking about boundaries and consent related to sex and intimacy and all of the things. Before we get into that, I do want to give a trigger warning right off the top. Obviously, because we are talking about 50 Shades of Grey, we're going to be talking about consent and consent violations and SA. We're also going to be talking about CSA because it's relevant to the movie. We're going to be talking about kink and BDSM and like sort of general, like that general arena. If any of those topics don't feel safe or comfortable, or you're not in a place where you can hear about that, I'm going to link a playlist up here that's filled with happy fun times, like footage of my dogs being goofs. Highly want to encourage you to take care of yourself above all else. So please feel free to leave. Again, if you're not safe, you're not comfortable, get out of here. I'm from New York now, I guess. I don't know what's going on. The other caveat that I want to give before we get into stuff is that this video is meant to be descriptive rather than prescriptive. I want to be clear. I, am a therapist. I'm an LMSW in case you're new here and you don't know. So we talk about therapist-y things. I'm a social worker and I feel qualified to talk about boundaries, the emotional impact of like poor boundaries and like that type of stuff. But by no means am I trying to position myself as an expert about the topic of consent, about the topic of kink or BDSM. And I really want to encourage people to view this video as a jumping off point for further learning. We're going to talk about lots of resources today. I'm going to link lots of things in the description that are great resources. I highly want to encourage you to do more research and to continue learning and like utilize the resources that I provided you with to continue growing your understanding of consent and boundaries related to intimacy and sex and all of the things. One of the things that we're going to talk about is that there is just a lot of evolution that has happened in this area, and it's very important for us to honor that this will be forever an ongoing conversation that is changing and growing, and we are all continuing to learn. And so again, this is not meant to be like the end all be all, like the video about boundaries and consent and all of the things. I wanted to make this as an effort to like put some good fact-based information about consent out on the internet. I am not blind to the fact that there's a lot of real bad sex education happening. So this felt like a good opportunity to educate about that. All of that said, let's talk about 50 Shades of Grey. I want to be clear, by the way, this is also not meant to be a comprehensive review of the film. We're super zooming in on one area of this, but I want to be clear. The film generally... Oh my god, there's supposed to be a fart noise and it didn't come out. Not good. Didn't like it. Don't recommend. Please, if you are a person who has not yet had sex and is interested in having sex, don't watch it. I mean, you can do whatever you want, but don't watch this movie with the understanding that this is at all a representation of what healthy boundaries in sex looks like, healthy relationships look like, healthy sex looks like. It's none of those things. I want to very much discourage anybody from utilizing this film or the books or like the series of films as a resource for sexual learning at all. If anything, we're using this as like a cautionary tale about all of the wrong things that are happening there. So before we jump into the hot garbage juice that is 50 Shades of Grey, let's talk about consent really briefly. There is a YouTube channel by a lovely human being. Her name is Hannah Witten. I've never heard her name pronounced without a British accent, so I don't know how to pronounce it as an American person. Hannah Witten, her YouTube channel talks about sex and intimacy and like kink generally. She's a gem. Her channel is just like a wealth of resources for all of those things. So I will link the video that I'm referencing specifically, but also like her channel generally in the description. But she made a video where she discusses the different consent models and how those have evolved over time. For those of you who don't know, the original consent model, I guess, that there was like a lot of public education about is the idea of like no means no, and that has evolved to become yes means yes, and that evolved into enthusiastic consent, and then that evolved into authentic consent. I don't want to rip off Hannah's content. So like I said, I'm going to link that video in the description. I would very much encourage you to go watch it. But for the sake of discussion, I want to talk about the general best practices that we have for consent nowadays. If you are a person who is my age or older, you were probably educated with either like the yes means yes or the enthusiastic consent model. The issue with these models is that it places a lot of undue burden on the person who is no longer comfortable with the sexual acts to say, excuse me, hello, hi, I'd like for this to stop now. And that's a very uncomfortable situation to be in. Even the yes means yes and enthusiastic consent model rely really heavily on this idea of like checking in with a partner and the partner saying either yes or no. And in the world, in the society that we live in, especially female or femme presenting folks and folks who find themselves at the lower end of like the sexual power hierarchy, can find it very difficult to say no or to communicate a lack of interest or enthusiasm for anything really. I mean, like, people have a hard time saying no to family members and like social engagements, and so especially in the middle of a very vulnerable, very intimate act, it can be very overwhelming to say, actually, no, I don't like that. So the authentic consent model is the like most up to date, and there's also like a wheel of consent. There's a diagram. It's a whole thing. Like I said, very much want to encourage you to watch the video to like gather the full context there. The general takeaway that I really want to encourage people to walk away from this video from, if you take nothing else, please hear this. It's very important for us to continue educating ourselves and continue learning about best practices when it comes to consent. I don't care how long you've been sexually active. I don't care how long you've been with your particular partner. It is still important for us to continue educating ourselves about this, because it does not matter if you feel like you and your partner or your partners or you as an individual have a good understanding of how that works. We all have room to grow. We all have room to learn. And especially those of us with more power historically because of our identity factors and our privilege, it's very important for us to understand the privilege and the power that we're walking into the room with and how we can potentially hurt other people. So I very, very strongly want to encourage people to embrace an attitude of like cautious, conscientious learning here. So we've talked about boundaries on the channel generally before. I actually have a whole playlist. I'll link it up there. But boundaries as it relates to sort of general relationship stuff is both very similar and very different from setting boundaries in a sexual context. I think it's very similar in the sense that honesty and openness are very important, but I think it's very different in that boundaries generally with family members, acquaintances, co-workers can be very amorphous, can be very, neither here nor there depending on your comfort level. And at the risk of sounding like an old lady and a mom, I really think it's important to put it out there that if someone is not comfortable having conversations about what they like or dislike, what their limits are, what their comfort level is, what their boundaries are around sex or intimate acts, I think it begs the question about whether that person is ready to be engaging in sexual or intimate acts in the first place. And so when we talk about the conversation of setting boundaries in this arena, it's very, very important that a person be comfortable setting those boundaries in the first place. When we talk about general boundary setting, I think it's important to lead with the energy of like meeting folks where they're at and approaching boundary setting from your level of comfort, and just kind of like, rolling with whatever your comfort level is. But with sex and intimacy, I think it's very important that we work towards developing a level of comfort that allows us to speak very clearly, very openly, very honestly with whoever we're going to be engaging in sexual acts with, because it's a very potentially traumatizing issue. There's a lot of emotions. There's a lot of potential trauma here. It's a very deeply personal thing. It's a very deeply vulnerable thing. So I really want to encourage people to, on your own side of the street, work towards developing that sense of empowerment and that sense of comfort to communicate those things. But as a partner, if you're engaging in sex acts with somebody else, to lead with this energy of asking conscientious and kind and compassionate and open questions to open that dialogue and to make your partner feel comfortable to voice those things to you in the first place. Because if we're doing both of those things, we can have a very open and easy and comfortable dialogue about what those boundaries look like. I know that that's probably a little bit convoluted. We're going to talk about how to actually set boundaries in a minute and like some concrete skills. So like stay with me. For now, one of the things that I wanted to talk about in regards to the actual movie was the contract scene.
Same page. Is the use of sex toys acceptable to the submissive? Vibrators okay? Dildos fine?
I think there's like sort of a duality going on here that's interesting that I wanted to discuss. Probably the only thing that I liked about this fucking movie is the presentation in the contract scene of their like very clear and explicit discussion of like, this act is okay, this act is not.
Genital clamps? Absolutely not.
Consider them gone.
How do you feel about this thing? I don't know, maybe we'll try it. Definitely no to that thing. I found that very refreshing.
What are butt plugs?
It's not particularly common for folks to have a very open conversation like that about these types of things, and so I thought that was nice for that to be portrayed, you know, like in popular media. But it was then quickly followed by this air, this energy. I think that it actually says explicitly in the contract that like any sexual act, you know, deemed appropriate by the dominant can be performed, and you like sign on the dotted line. It's this energy of like, if you say yes or it's listed in the category of like accepted, then that's presented as an evergreen yes to that activity, no matter what, forever.
The submissive will agree to any sexual activity deemed fit and pleasurable by the dominant, accepting those activities outlined in hard limits.
That's not how it fucking works. That's not what healthy fucking consent is supposed to look like, and I really want to discourage people from taking that interaction to be at all indicative of what healthy boundaries look like in sex. It's important for us to talk about this because the research is clear that the vast majority of SA is perpetrated by somebody that the victim knows. We know that around 8 out of 10 of SAs are perpetrated by someone the victim is familiar with. And so despite the fact that we have a lot of rhetoric about stranger danger and people lurking in alleyways or jumping out of bushes, we know that statistically speaking, that's rare. It does happen, and those encounters are, you know, traumatizing and perfectly valid to feel how you feel about. But because of the shame and the fear and the trauma that exists as a result of these encounters, I think it's really important for us to talk about this, because this representation in a hugely popular film of this like evergreen yes to a sexual act, people, you know, undoubtedly walked away from this movie with this perspective that that's a perfectly acceptable thing to do. And it is not. Consent can be revoked at any time, and sex or consent for one sexual act is not consent for other sexual acts. And even if you have given consent for one sex act, that doesn't mean that you're consenting to do that sex act for X amount of time or that you're continuing to want to do that. It's very important for us to adopt this attitude that consent can and, you know, is liable to be revoked at any time, and that's perfectly okay. So this contract scene really fucking pushed my buttons. And I know that there is the discussion of the safe word and those types of things, and we're going to talk about kink in a minute.
When the safe word read is spoken, the dominant's action will cease completely and immediately.
But I want to be clear, this film is not at all a representation of what healthy kink or BDSM relationships look like either. And so they don't get to hide behind the excuse of the safe word, in my opinion, because they still did a terrible fucking job of representing how that safeguard is supposed to work also. Another thing that I wanted to talk about from the film is the topic of sexual coercion. I did have a great article, a great piece of research that talked about this and had wonderful statistics in it, and it was freely available to the public. Now it's fucking not. So I had to find new things, but we can see from some research that's not behind a paywall that sexual coercion is a very common behavior and tends to be most often perpetrated by men. When we talk about sexual coercion, what we're referring to is not necessarily, it can be the use of force, but often sexual coercion encompasses the idea of coercing a person into sexual activity through the use of drugs or alcohol, through the use of persuasion, through the use of shaming or guilting the victim, through the use of like repeatedly wearing down the victim. There are lots of very toxic and very abusive behaviors, especially verbal behaviors. There can also be coercion through violent means, especially with the use of weapons and those types of things. But again, this is one of those conversations where it's important for us to talk about the seemingly less obvious forms of assault here, because we do get education about, how it's not okay to coerce someone into sex or intimacy through the use of, a weapon or through the use of violence. But we don't really talk about how pouting when your partner says no to sex is coercive and is abusive and is a consent violation or is an attempt at a consent violation. The reason that we're talking about this is because the movie does this a lot, where there's this depiction of Christian trying to obtain consent in the moment while sex and intimacy are already happening. Again, very much inappropriate and super fucking red flag. I want to encourage people, again, to have conversations about boundaries, about consent, about likes and dislikes and do's and don'ts well before we are in the moment, before things are happening, before we feel things, before we're physically involved, because trying to obtain consent while a person is in this emotionally charged state is highly inappropriate and it is coercive. It's a very inappropriate depiction of sex being this like wonderfully magic, fancy, cool, sexy thing, and like, no, it's not. It's actually just sexually coercive, and I'm very frustrated that this film portrayed this as like some kind of hot, steamy thing when actually all it's doing is trampling on people's understanding of what healthy boundaries should look like in sex. So with that said, I think that's a good nice segue for us to talk about how to actually set boundaries in regards to sex and intimacy. And I think it will come to no one's surprise that my first tip here is to sit down and have an open and honest conversation with your partner about what your likes and dislikes are. I know that this can be uncomfortable. I know that this can feel silly and cringy and embarrassing. And don't get me wrong, it doesn't have to look like a group therapy session or a couples therapy session. It's very possible for that conversation to happen in a more casual realm, and potentially for that conversation to happen even in a romantic or like kind of vaguely sexy way. Because talking about your likes and dislikes in sex is kind of sexy in a way, and it's perfectly fine for you to have that conversation in a way that is, fun and interesting and happy and doesn't have to look like, awkward and like you're white knuckling your way through it. But I do want to encourage people to have that conversation in a hands-off way, and to have that conversation well in advance of actually participating in any type of sex act. And that includes like sexting, sending photos of one another, virtual sex, those types of things. Those can still include consent violations also, and it's very important for us to own and honor that. I also touched on this earlier, but one of the things that I think is very key when we talk about setting boundaries in relation to sex and intimacy is to have a reciprocal conversation. What I mean by this is that it is important for us to voice our own likes and dislikes and to feel comfortable and empowered and safe to talk about that. But it can also be very helpful, especially if you are the partner who occupies identity factors that provide you with more social privilege or power, to be willing to open that conversation and to ask, again, like the compassionate, curious questions. I want to encourage you to take the emotional labor off the backs of people who can feel very unsafe and very uncomfortable in voicing these things. It can go a long way to say, hey, I was thinking we could have a conversation about this, that, or the other before we actually start doing these things. Here are some things that I like and dislike, and I was really curious what your comfort level is. Can you talk to me about this? It's very important for us to have these conversations in that reciprocal way, because that in and of itself is going to help us create a feeling of safety in the partnership. And I know this is like very ideal world type of stuff, and I want to be clear, it is possible for boundaries to be imperfect, and these conversations to be kind of like herky-jerky, all over the place. That's perfectly fine. I'm not saying that your partner is not worthy of being in a relationship with you or being intimate with you if they're not having conversations in this way, but I do want to encourage people to lean into the idea that you deserve a romantic partner, sexual partner, intimate partner who is willing and comfortable to have these conversations with you. Because again, at the risk of sounding like an old lady, I think if someone is not ready or willing to have clear conversations with you, or to honor you saying, hey, I don't feel comfortable in engaging in these types of situations with you until you've heard how I feel about these things, maybe they're not a partner who is worth your time in the first place. I hope it's not a hot take, but I think it's true. I also am going to link in the description an article from Allure, actually, of all places, that I thought had some interesting discussion about boundaries related to sex and intimacy. So I'm going to link that in the description also. One of the things that they talk about in the article is the prevalence of people feeling uncomfortable with voicing boundaries because their boundaries were repeatedly disrespected in childhood. And I think this is a great thing for us to talk about because, again, boundaries don't exist in a vacuum, and especially boundaries related to sex and intimacy. It's not like this is the only place that we're setting boundaries. A lot of the empowerment and the comfort and the feelings that we will bring into the room when we set sexual and intimate boundaries are also related to the core beliefs that we have about ourselves that inform the other boundaries that we're setting. And so I think when we talk about setting boundaries with partners, sometimes the self-reflection piece is a really useful thing to do before we even get into the conversation of setting boundaries with a partner. This is a therapy channel. I'm also going to unapologetically encourage anyone who is struggling with some maybe uncomfortable feelings about yourself. The fancy therapy word is like negative core beliefs about yourself. But if you feel some type of way about setting boundaries and it feels particularly uncomfortable for you, I would encourage you to use the links in my description to talk with a therapist about that, because I would be curious about whether there's some stuff going on there, and therapists can be a great person to help you work through why you feel that way, where that came from, and then work through how to be more empowered and feel safe to set those boundaries in the future. But generally, I do want to encourage people to do some self-reflection about your values, your beliefs, your experiences with boundaries generally before we sit down and have that conversation with others. The last thing that we're going to touch on really quickly before we wrap this video up is the kink and BDSM aspect of the film.
There are some terms which need clarification.
And again, I want to be clear, I am not the authority on this topic. I am by no means an expert on this topic. I'm not a sex therapist. This is not my field of expertise. However, it is very important for us to honor that the representation of kink and BDSM in this film is wholly inaccurate. I want to encourage anyone who had an awakening watching this film to pursue resources about how to practice kink and BDSM in a safe way.
Something to consider.
In a way that it is informed by healthy and safe boundaries, and in a way that is far and away the opposite of what the film portrays. There are so many resources across the internet. I'll link a couple of things in the description, but there's lots of learning to be done there. And again, it's very much one of those issues that we will continue to learn. It's like a whole wide world of stuff, really. But I don't want people to walk away from this film with the expectation or the belief that anyone who participates in kink or BDSM is this like inherently damaged person who their sexual preferences just eclipse their whole personhood. That's not how it works. It's entirely possible to have an interest in these types of sexual activities or these like sexual leanings that don't have anything to do with your whole personhood. It doesn't have to take up your whole life. It can be just sort of like a one-off, like a thing, like I also like to eat tomatoes, but that's not my whole goddamn personality. I'm not wearing a tomato suit to work, and so I think it's important for us to adopt that energy when we talk about kink and BDSM also. The other thing that I want to talk about is the portrayal of Christians' interest in kink and BDSM being a result of CSA. This grinds my gears. It's super fucking inappropriate for this film and the series and these books to portray this in this way, because I think the message that a lot of people walked away with is that the only person who could be interested in these types of sexual activities is someone who is so inherently damaged and traumatized that they're into like fucked up stuff. That's not how it works. Hi friends, we're taking a quick pause here because there's a very important clarification for me to make that I forgot to make because I got angry and frustrated. I want to be super clear. The film insinuates that being a victim or a survivor of CSA makes you a damaged or broken or fucked up kind of person. And I want to be super clear. That's not the case. That's not something that I believe. That's not something that's reflected in the clinical work or the research. The truth is that victims and survivors of CSA and trauma generally really can and very much do go on to heal and live perfectly normal and healthy and wonderful lives, and it's very irresponsible and very gross for the film to perpetuate this narrative and to insinuate that these two identity factors are linked in this way, because we know that that's not always the case. It doesn't have to be the case, and for them to assert that being a victim of trauma makes you a damaged or broken person, because we also know that that's not fucking true. So I wanted to clarify that. Okay, thanks, bye. It like simultaneously does a disservice to survivors of CSA and to people who are interested in kink. And those two things, it's like a Venn diagram. Those two things don't have to be mutually exclusive or mutually inclusive. I want to encourage people to, again, educate themselves about the intersecting identities that exist there. It's just simply untrue, this representation that the only person who could be interested in kink or BDSM is someone who is a survivor of CSA, and for that interest to come from a place of fucked upness. The truth is that the film portrays Christian as a survivor of CSA and grooming, and apparently that parlayed into an interest in these activities, but that's not, that may be the case for some people in real life, but that's not always how it works for all people. I hope that that makes sense. Yeah, that's another thing that's important for us to call out, is this relationship that he has with the person who abused him as a child, and they act like this is perfectly normal, and like, oh, that's not what it was. It is. It is. That was abuse, and that's not okay, and it is very inappropriate for an abuser to insist that their victim be friends with them and give them access to their life. Like, just no. Very, very inappropriate. I don't want to police how victims of CSA respond or deal with abuse, because I think that that's gross and inappropriate. So I don't want to like come for Christian, I guess, but I do very much disagree with the way that the film and the author and the director and like the whole thing portrayed these different identity characteristics, because like I said, it simultaneously disses two separate, sometimes intersecting groups of people for different reasons, and it's just like all bad. It's just all fucking bad. The last like takeaway that I wanted to talk about here again is just the idea that kink and BDSM in real life are a community that is very much focused around the idea of consent and safety and mutual enjoyment. And so the film portraying Christian and Anna's arrangement as like, I'll only spend time with you if you agree to let me hurt you.
How about once a week, on a night of your choosing, we go on a date?
Is super inaccurate and also abusive. This is abusive. That's not what kink looks like. No one who is actually interested in kink would participate in an activity that is only painful or not fun for someone else. If they do, that's not kink, that's not fun. Run away from that person because they're abusive. This portrayal of like, I enjoy actually hurting you is not how that's supposed to work. That's just regular abuser stuff. That's not at all reflective of like kink or BDSM. That's not how it's supposed to work. And again, I'm not the authority on this topic. I am not at all an educator or an expert about kink or BDSM, and I will link things in the description for people who are, but even just based on my like cursory Google knowledge, that's not how this works. So like I said, not meant to be a comprehensive review of the film, but those are the things that I wanted to talk about today. I'm happy to dive back into the film if you guys want me to talk about it more. Let me know what your guys' thoughts and feelings and opinions are in the comments. I want to encourage people to be mindful that if you are going to share stuff in the comments, to please be careful to not use language that might be triggering to other folks. The comment section is like public and permanent. It's the internet, so be mindful of that too. Only share to your comfort level, and please be mindful that we're creating a community that's meant to feel safe for everyone. That said, I hope that you guys found this video interesting or useful. Like the video if you like the video, because that lets me know you guys want to see more content like this, and it also helps the channel, so maybe go like it anyways. Subscribe to the channel because we do videos like this. We also have like fun therapist reacts moments every now and again, so click the notification bell if you want to be notified every time I upload a video, and then share the video to help the channel grow and to help each other grow, and I will see you guys next Saturday. Okay, bye.